Welcome to the Mets Pod. On today's show, we're going to get into the rotation as Max Scherzer has officially made his way back to the big league club. Jacob deGrom in the process of that as he is on his rehab assignment. Taijuan Walker carrying things for this rotation, and Eduardo Escobar breaking out in the lineup finally. And after that, we're going to take a look at what's going down in the farm system as top prospect Francisco Alvarez gets promoted to Triple-A and makes his debut in a big-time way. And we're going to get into a little MLB draft today as Joe dropped his mock 2.0. And as always, we're going to close out the show answering your mailbag questions. So, reminder, subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Mets Pod. I'm your host, Kumar Rocker, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. The Mets, after dropping 3 of 4, have won 3 of 4. So the Mets back on track, and in a big way, Max Scherzer is making his return to the mound on Tuesday evening as Jacob deGrom looks to do the same thing. So, Joe, let's bring you in there. Start right off. A lot of, knock on wood, good news in Mets land, as not only is the big league club winning, we have a Francisco Alvarez promotion, but most importantly, arguably the two biggest pieces on this team are actually pitching, making their way back to being a part of this Mets big league club.
I mean, after Saturday's season-ending loss to the Rangers, or at least that certainly was the perception after they lost the game, that the season was over, the Mets are picking right back up where they left off. They, took the series like they've been doing consistently all season, and now they're in Cincinnati. Take game 1, and like you said, Max Scherzer comes back tonight. Jacob deGrom's on the mend, rehabbing in the minor leagues. Things are starting to look up Mets here.
All right, let's start right there with Scherzer, who has made his way back to the big league club. Joe, it feels like so long ago that we almost forgot how Scherzer was living up to the billing. Everything the Mets could have asked for and more, pitching to a 2.54 ERA in 8 starts, striking out almost 11 per 9. Max Scherzer, even at his age, was looking like the guy Mets fans had hoped for and wished for. So now he's back. What do you expect from Scherzer? Do you think this is a situation where, with an oblique injury, the Mets are going to be a little cautious? They might not be. We know Scherzer's a guy. We saw it in spring training. There's no ramp-up period with this guy. It's get right back into the swing of things. I pitch deep into games. Do you think there's going to be a period of caution? Or is Scherzer the kind of guy that you go, you know your body, you have a certain mindset, we're going to let you dictate how far you can go each night?
I would say more of the latter than the former. I think they'll trust Scherzer. That doesn't mean they're going to be pushing him to 110 or 115 pitches tonight, but I think they're going to let him go. I think the Mets were certainly patient with him, and then obviously being patient with Jacob deGrom. I think Max is ready to go. I think Max is going to be Max. He's going to be the bulldog out there. He's going to miss bats, like you said. And tonight in Cincinnati, it's a ballpark that he has had quite a bit of success at. It's only 4 starts in his career, but he's 4-0 with a 0.33 ERA in his career at Great American Little League Park, where everything just seemingly flies out.
That
Max
right
Scherzer,
field, man.
Yeah. It just goes. But Max has something going there, and I expect him to come back and just be Max Scherzer.
Yeah, it's just amazing how different this rotation looks with him at the front of it, even without deGrom, even without McGill right now. We know Taijuan Walker has pitched another all-star caliber first half of the season again. We've had the highs and lows of Bassett and Carrasco. David Peterson has been a nice surprise as a fill-in for the most part. But when you bump out the Trevor Williams starts and put in Max Scherzer, that is a massive trickle effect at a time where we know they have the Reds, right? We know they're going to see the Marlins again real soon. This is a team that would love to start getting more of that pad of a first-place lead again. Even though they're 20 games over 500, the Braves have been a really, really good team this year. You'd like to build up some wins before you get to that big National League Series and meet up against the Braves. But we know what the dream is here. Scherzer being back, that's great. We know the dream that was put in place when this team was established and formed in the winter was to have Jacob deGrom pitch, and then the next night, Max Scherzer pitch. Jacob deGrom makes his first rehab start of the year, throwing 100 over and over again. Not hitting 100, working up to 100. DeGrom comes out and is throwing 100. He strikes out 5 of the 6 batters he faced. I think he hit the other guy in the foot, so it's not even like they're making contact against Jacob DeGrom. Joe, when you hear that, you're obviously an evaluator of college prospects. You follow the minor league system for the Mets closer than anybody. With DeGrom, I see a lot of responses from fans that it's almost worry, right? It's like, why is he constantly coming out and just throwing over 100 right out of the gate? There's no ramp up. But do you think for a guy like that is so physically different than 99.9% of players that take the mound in the big leagues, that's just who he is, and there is no, let me dial it back a little bit?
I think if Jacob deGrom tried to dial it back, I think you'd actually probably be increasing his chance of getting hurt. Because Jacob deGrom throwing 100 miles an hour, while a lot of pitchers cannot do that, and certainly cannot do that as consistently as he can, him throwing 100 isn't overthrowing. I mean, obviously, it's led to some injuries here over the last year, but I think it's who he is. And it's similar to the conversation we're having about Max Scherzer. There's no ramping up Jacob deGrom. The Mets arguably have the 2 biggest alpha pitchers in the entire major leagues on their staff. So I'm not worried. I think it's exciting that after all this time, he's back on the mound, he's pitching in games, and the velocity is still there. Because if he was throwing 95, 96, I'm sure the tweets would be, Jacob deGrom he's hurt. He's still hurt. He's not healthy. He's not ready to come back.
Goes both ways.
Yeah, I guess there's no win here. But to me, Jacob deGrom looked just like Jacob deGrom, which is what I was hoping to see. And like you said, he had the fastball. It was 98 was the slowest one that he threw. He touched 100.9, so basically 101. And he was throwing quite a few sliders in the 91 to 94 range and sprinkled in a couple changeups too. So despite a very abbreviated 24 pitch outing, it seems like he really got his work in. It wasn't just get out there and throw the baseball.
No, not at all. Like you said, the breaking ball was working for him, and he was going to that pitch a lot. So DeGrom is a guy that I think has been, very publicly frustrated by these injuries over the last year. A guy that is also frustrated with his contract and with an opt-out option in place for the end of this season. And the fact that this Mets team, let's be real, Jacob deGrom has been here for a long time. There have not been a lot of seasons like this where you're sitting from the sideline and going, man, I'm the best pitcher in baseball. What can this team be if I can get back out there? So I don't really ever question motivation as a factor for any guy of Jacob deGrom's caliber, but I think there's a totally different animal in place here for him to come back and have a second half and a postseason, unlike any other for him in his career. So when you look at it, the Mets going to be finishing up a series with the Reds. They got the Marlins, of course, the Braves, and the Cubs all before the All-Star break. Let's talk timeline here, Joe. And I know it's the dreaded question of DeGrom, but now that we have him facing live pro hitters, in a sense, 2 innings of work, essentially, that was full throttle. It was not just fastballs. There was sliders thrown in there. It was high velocity. You see how he acted after. I saw you tweet out the clip, my shoulder is fine. I'm ready. Like, what is the timeline here? Do you think, because we have to factor in, he did not pitch in the second half of last year, is this a situation where, yes, you got to work up to 5-6 innings at some point, but do you have to do that multiple times before the thought is even close to getting back to the big league club?
So I think if all goes well in between each start and he continues to build up his pitch count and his inning count, I think he has 3 more starts in the minor leagues before he's getting back. So I'll give him 4 rehab starts, which is more or less a spring training, right? And that's kind of what you're doing. So rather than rushing him when they don't need to, like you said at the top of the show, the Mets are 20 games over 500 right now. They're in first place. The Dodgers join them as the only other NL team with 50 wins. The Mets are in a perfectly fine position to make sure Jacob deGrom is right when he comes back, because if the Mets have those World Series aspirations, they're going to need Jacob deGrom to be there. So getting 1 extra start in July isn't worth, the potential risk that comes along with pushing him back to the major leagues, maybe a start or 2 too soon. So I think you're looking at, like I said, 3 more and get him up to 5 innings, 80 pitches in that neighborhood, and then at that point, bring him back.
I'm with you. All right, before we move on to look at the lineup a little bit and do some recapping here, I think it's the time where we have to talk about the unsung hero that has been Taijuan Walker this year, right? He obviously starts out the year a little banged up, where he almost became not the forgotten man, but there was no eyeballs on or expectations on Taijuan Walker. He had an all-star first half last year and a really rough second half, and then he comes into this year banged up, where everybody's like, okay, well, we want to see deGrom, we want to see Scherzer, we want to see Bassett, the youngster and McGill out there throwing, 98, 99. Taijuan Walker right now, Joe, I don't know where this team is without Taijuan Walker right now. When you look at the fact that he's gotten a win in the last 4 of his 5 starts, the one where he didn't, he threw over 7 innings of shutout ball against maybe the best team in baseball, the Houston Astros. So when you look at Taijuan Walker right now, I know the question, unfortunately, always around him is, can he replicate this in the second half of the season, because he couldn't do it last year? Joe, I don't know if I care about that right now. What I care about is Taijuan Walker has been the ace, you could say it, the ace of this rotation that has not had Jacob deGrom, that has not had Max Scherzer, and that recently has not had Tyler McGill, where he's throwing a sub-3 ERA. He's pitching deep into games. He has not thrown less than 6 innings in a start since June 2nd. So, I mean, you're looking at it with Taijuan Walker right now. I don't know if the argument is, oh, he's an all-star. Like, I don't really feel the need to go there. But if you want to talk about an unsung hero wearing orange and blue, it is absolutely him. And what a contract that has been for the New York Mets.
Walker just quietly goes about his business. There's no flash to him. He doesn't have the craziest stuff. So, like, when he's pitching, you're not, like, watching a radar gun or watching some crazy breaking ball like you see with Chris Bassett. He just goes out there, takes the ball every 5th day, and like you said, he's been fantastic. Over his last 5 starts, he has an ERA of 2.25 and has struck out more than a batter per inning. He struck out 36 guys across 32 innings, pushing his season ERA down to 2.86, which, you know, like you said, we don't need to get into the debate, is he an all-star, etc. But he's in a position where he was an all-star last year. His first half is just as good as his first half was last year. It just kind of had that that delayed start. So I think Walker's been, like you said, an unsung hero, clearly the most consistent pitcher on the staff. And, you know, if he does make a second all-star team, talk about a contract. Like you said, that's 2 years. I think he's making $7.5 million or something like that this year, maybe $8 million. And you might get 2 all-star appearances out of it. Taijuan Walker's been an absolute godsend for the Mets this year.
I think these are the kind of guys, Joe, that when the Mets get fully ramped up in this new mold that they have under Cohen and obviously this front office, that these are the guys that you love to sign, right? Like it's exciting for the fans when you go out and get Max Scherzer. Don't make any mistake. I'm not trying to get away from spending that kind of money. But when you can go find the tier 3 free agents that you project as a 5th starter with upside, and they perform for you like a 2nd or 3rd starter, that's what the best organizations in baseball do. They find something about you that they say, okay, we can get your game here much higher than it is. You can outperform where you've been at. So that's been a lot of fun. I want to ask you one thing, actually, Joe. You spoke on it briefly with Walker. Isn't it fascinating how some games he comes out and he's striking out almost 2 batters, per inning? He's can be 13 over 9 or 15 over 9. Then other games, like the Astros, he's not striking out anyone. He's pitching to contact, and it's working. Is there any strategy to that where he's effective both pitching to contact or when he needs to strike out? Because I haven't seen a lot of guys like him that on any given night he could strike out 9 to 10 guys, and on any given night he could strike out 2 guys and still give you 6 innings of 1-run ball. It's bizarre.
It is bizarre. I think part of it is he's not the biggest stuff guy in the world, so it really has to be on for him to miss bats at location, and everything has to be clicking for him to miss bats at a high level. And if his stuff is just okay on a given day, which happens a lot, he doesn't have, the velo and all that stuff to back up and just automatically go strike out 7 or 8 guys. But, when you go back, briefly here to your point about the 3rd tier guys and the smaller contracts, those are going to be huge. I mean, that's what the Mets brought in this 30-plus person analytics team for, to identify the Taijuan Walker type of people every single offseason.
Yeah.
Mark Canha, Escobar, who we'll talk about in a second, but, the splashy names are great, but you're going to win on those second tier free agents that exceed expectations. You can't pay every single position. Despite how much money Steve Cohen has, you're not going to have a $20 million player at every single spot. So you have to be able to find those mid-level guys, identify them, show like, all right, when we signed this guy, we could get this much more out of him. Those are the signs of what a really sound, consistent winning baseball club will be, not necessarily the long-term, massive money contracts.
All right, speaking of one of those guys, Eduardo Escobar, you mentioned it, Joe. Obviously, what we call the Band-Aid contract, the bridge guy on that 2-year deal. Unfortunately for Escobar, it's been a tough first half. He was brought in here a little different than a lot of the players they have, right? When you look at Nimmo and Canna, on-base kind of guys, with Escobar, you knew that's not the mold of his game, but he can hit you 30 home runs on any given season, and you feel really good about that, especially solving the third base spot for the Mets that has been a little bit of an issue in recent history. So we've waited. Buck Showalter has been patient. There have been cries for Escobar to either be moved down the lineup, which he has, or decrease playing time. 3 home runs in 3 games against the Rangers, and huge home runs for Escobar. Game-changing home runs. A guy that brings, besides Alonso and Lindor, who are going to hit their home runs, but they are star players. This Mets lineup has been lacking the home run, and they've found ways to constantly get offense despite that. But at some point of the year, Joe, this is a team that's going to need to hit some home runs. Yes, you can find a power bat at the deadline, probably on the somewhat cheap or cost-effective way, but they need Escobar to get going, and it's finally looking like the confidence is back and that home run swing is clicking.
He definitely seems more confident, and he's a guy that you just see the rest of the team is genuinely happy that he is starting to turn it around. Like Eduardo, I haven't seen a free agent signing like Eduardo Escobar that feels like he just gels into the team so smoothly and has quietly become like almost a pseudo leader spokesman. Like they go to him for quotes, even though obviously he has a translator. He's still a guy that they're going to for that type of stuff. And like you said, the power, something this lineup absolutely needs. I expect before the trade deadline there will be an external addition to help out at designated hitter or maybe a different spot. But third base, it's Eduardo Escobar's job, and it has to be. I mean, Luis Guillorme is a guy that we've talked about over the last few weeks. He's a very valuable piece to this club for his defense and everything and his contact ability. But as he started playing more and more, you're starting to see, the offense, he's just not quite an everyday guy offensively. So they need Escobar's bat to wake up, and it seems like it has. It's just a few-day sample size, so I'm not going to go crazy. But I think it's, like you said, he's hit 30 home runs before. He's hit 25-plus home runs before. That doesn't really happen by accident. So I'm optimistic that Eduardo Escobar is going to start his turnaround now.
And the offense has weathered the storm, right? Without him having that kind of success or what he's used to as a power bat, they've gotten by. But like you said, this is somebody that he's hit 35 home runs in the season. He hit 28 home runs last year. You always say it, Joe, you kind of are what the back of your baseball card says you are, and Eduardo Escobar is that 25 to 30 home run kind of player that the Mets were hoping for. And if he can get it going, it brings an entirely different dimension to this Mets lineup that they don't have, which is secondary power. You can't rely on Pete Alonso to hit a home run every single night, as much as he's trying his best to do so. Francisco Lindor, one of the rare shortstops in baseball that has 30 home run type of power in him. You just can't rely on those guys to do it every single night. That's why Escobar was brought here, so that's a big sign for the Mets. All right, reminder, you are listening to the Mets Pod. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch on SNY's YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. Or a good time to remind you guys, if you want to send mailbag questions, you can follow Joe at PSL The Flushing on Twitter. I'm at Connor J. Rogers. We love interacting with everybody, even when we're not doing the show, so that's a good place to do that. All right, let's take a look at the farm system, Joe, because for everything happening with the big league club, whether it is also Max Scherzer and Jacob deGrom pitching in the minors, there's actual prospects that matter a lot in the Mets farm system. Francisco Alvarez, promoted to AAA. There's a lot here, right? Makes the debut in Syracuse, gets the single with the bases loaded. It didn't take long for him to make an impact on that kind of team. but he threw out a runner, stealing second. We see the arm strength with him. You know what this brings to the table for you, Joe, specifically, as a guy that's preached patience for Francisco Alvarez. You have said he needs to develop defensively. He's not coming up just to be a power bat. He's coming up to be the catcher of the next 10 years, an all-star caliber catcher. Him being promoted to AAA is this, it's a step where there's only one more until it's the big leagues. What do you think is next for Alvarez in AAA to reach that mountain to get to the big leagues? And do you think this opens the door that there's any chance we do see him in 2022? Something he's been vocal about as a goal of his.
You never say never. I don't want to say he won't get called up. I personally don't think this is the team and the time to be doing that. The Mets are looking to make a World Series type run, and very often prospects have an adjustment period on the offensive side of the ball once they get to major leagues. Look at guys like Adley Rutschman. Look at Jared Kelenic. These are guys that were putting up monster AAA numbers, were huge prospects just like Alvarez. Kelenic's back down in AAA, hasn't been able to get back up. Rutschman's struggling in the early going. So I don't think the Mets need to put on Alvarez's plate, all right, you now have to come in and perform day one because we're trying to win a World Series here. But the promotion to AAA, to me, is a reward for a job well done in AA. He accomplished what he needed to there, and there's no reason to keep him in AA for the sake of doing so. At the AAA level, let's see him continue to work on that pitch framing, the blocking balls, the game preparation. That's all things that Reed Brignac, the manager of AA Rumble Ponies, told myself and Jacob Resnick on the last episode of Mets Perspective, which you could find on SNY. So continued growth there. And at the AAA level, what's going to be different from an offensive side of the ball is pitch recognition is going to be big, because he may not be facing a lot of the same top prospects that he was facing in AA, but he's going to be facing more experienced arms that are going to be willing to pitch backwards, throw breaking balls in counts that are typically fastball counts. So he's going to have to be, on his game as far as pitch recognition. And yeah, I think it's an exciting time. And could he get called up this year? Sure. I don't think it's impossible to say, but my guess would be the Mets will play it safe, let him continue to develop, and make that offensive addition from another club here in the next under a month now. It's 3.5 weeks until the trade deadline.
So I know it's so easy to get caught up in the constant moment, right? The Mets are a great team. The Mets have not gotten offensive production out of the DH or catcher spot. We know what that's going to bring. That's going to bring the cries for their top prospect, who some very reliable people think is maybe the best prospect in the minor leagues right now, or at least one of the best prospects in the minor leagues right now. But Joe, I want to kind of scale this back. We've talked about Alvarez overachieving at all his stops for his age. It seems like he's overachieving for his age, for his stops. Getting the call up to AAA, which I think we would both agree was a nice surprise that he's performed well enough at AA to get to AAA already. Does this maybe open the door for him to be the starting catcher in 2023 out of the gate, now that he's getting experience versus guys that bounce up and down between the majors? Let's call it what it is. Is this a step for something like that, where the Mets are going to be trying to contend in 2023 too? They are not resetting, getting younger, or trying to rebuild. Their window is still open next year as well. And can he be a big part of that?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. And if you asked me in the springtime, a couple months back, I would say maybe mid 2023.
That's why I asked.
But he has clearly elevated his game. I mentioned that Reed Brignac joined us on Mets Perspective. He said actually that Alvarez was graded out as the best pitch framer in the AA Eastern League. So the growth is there. The work ethic is there. There's still a couple more steps to make that he may not be able to make in time to have an impact on the 2022 Mets. But regardless of James McCann's contract, he hasn't been good on the offensive side of the ball. I mean, it's bad what he's doing offensively.
Hasn't been serviceable is the bigger issue.
Yeah. He hasn't even been, passable for sure. Defensively, it's great, but Alvarez is going to be forcing their hand. And I think when you think about the beginning of 2023, you can withstand that adjustment period of Alvarez to the major leagues if you're doing it in April. because, all right, it's going to take a few weeks, whatever, he gets adjusted. You have other guys to pick up the slack because you're not in the middle of a pennant race, which the Mets are about to be. So I think the conversation has definitely shifted to he could potentially be the opening day catcher, and the Mets are just going to have to figure out what they do with a contract like James McCann or a guy like Tomas Nido. They're just going to have to figure it out because Alvarez is going to force their hand at some point in time.
All right, speaking of the young talent, obviously huge MLB draft for the Mets this year. We've talked about it briefly on this show, and we talk about the draft a lot on all our Mets content, but it's about that time, Joe. We're getting really, really close. Obviously, the Mets picking 11th and 14th. They have the extra first-round pick because they did not sign Kumar Rocker last year, who we will touch on in a brief moment. But I want to open things up with your mock draft 2.0 that was on SNY .tv. The 11th overall selection, you had them taking outfielder Justin Crawford from Bishop Gorman, obviously a big-time high school program, not just in baseball, but also in football. A lot of big-time athletes come from there. What do you see in this pick, and how does it kind of correlate with, you think, the Mets' overall strategy with these two first-rounders in the top 15? Pretty unprecedented territory, or at least the first time in a long time.
Definitely unprecedented for the Mets. The last time they had two first-round picks, they drafted Ike Davis and Reese Havens. Ike Davis was 19 overall, and Havens was something in the 20s. So two top 15 is unprecedented for this team. And Justin Crawford is the son of former Tampa Bay Ray outfielder Carl Crawford. There's quite a few sons in this draft, and some are going to go very high. Andrew Jones' son is probably the odds-on favorite to go number one overall. Jackson Holliday, the son of Matt Holliday, is probably going to go in the top 5. Luke Hollier's son is going to go in the top 10. I could keep going. There's plenty.
Crazy.
But Justin Crawford, like you said, out of Bishop Gorman, out in Nevada, plays like his dad. I mean, it's a 70 grade speed. Arguably the fastest player
fast
in the draft.
For people that don't know the MLB grading
Yeah.
system, that is really fast.
He's probably one of the top 3 fastest players in this class, and certainly the fastest player that's going to go in the first round. And he's elevated his game this spring. His contact rate has improved. He barreled balls up more consistently. He's physically matured a bit, so you saw a little more power this year than you had previously. I don't think he's ever going to be a big power hitter, but he's a guy that can play center field or left if you want him to, whatever. But he's a premium athlete. That is something that Billy Epler has historically liked. If you go back to his Angels draft picks, he likes high athletic outfielders. And, Justin Crawford's a guy that I think the Mets have interest in. And he really fits the mold of a high upside pick, which is something the Mets are trying to accomplish with these extra picks. You mentioned 11 and 14. They also have a compensatory pick at number 75 for Noah Syndergaard signing with the Angels. So they have 5 of the first 90. It's a chance to really bring some high upside into the system, and I think you're going to see the Mets really go for it here early on in the draft.
Yeah, the Crawford pick is really exciting to me. Obviously, the speed, that kind of upside, like you said. And I think if there was ever a year to swing for the fences, it's this year, because the fact that you have 2 top 15 picks, it hurts a little less if you do miss or that guy doesn't fill out to his potential like you expect. So at 14, you have them addressing a need that we have talked about a lot. There are not a lot of high-profile arms in the system right now, especially healthy arms when you look at what Matt Allen's gone through with his injuries. And, of course, you have them taking a college arm because we know it has been an eternity since the Mets have taken a high school arm in the first round. So who'd you have them going with here?
I went with left-handed pitcher Connor Prelip out of the University of Alabama. So last spring, he underwent Tommy John surgery, which, we'll talk about it as we get closer to the draft here, that there's a lot of college arms that underwent Tommy John this spring who would have been first-round considerations that likely will not now. But Prelip at that time was considered a guy that, hey, think about him in 2022 as the potential number 1 overall pick. And
wow,
he underwent Tommy John, made his full recovery. He's thrown twice for teams, once in a private bullpen session and the other time at the MLB Draft Combine, where they could put him on with all the TrackMan and Rapsodo data. And at this point, Connor Prelip kind of looks like the guy that he was. I mean, his fastball was averaging 93 miles an hour at the Combine. He really is a guy that sat 92 to 94 and touch 95 or 96 when he was truly healthy. So his velo's pretty much back. His slider is the best slider in the class. I mean, it's a true, like I said, 70 grade on Crawford speed. It's a true 70 grade slider. He had over 3,000 RPMs on it, which, to put in perspective, would probably be like a top 10 or 15 RPM slider in the major leagues. So it's a premium pitch. He needs some work on that third pitch, his changeup, and he hasn't pitched in a while. So while there's some risk, there also is really high upside, like I mentioned. Could have been a guy that, if he were healthy, be in consideration to go number 1 overall this year. He falls due to the injury and kind of the limited sample size that you have of him pitching. High upside, but a little higher floor than a guy like Crawford, who they took at 11, which the floor is much lower, big time upside. And I think the Mets realize, and Mark Chimuta actually said this recently in an interview, they may never have this type of pick situation again, so they really have to make it count.
Yeah, they shouldn't, right? You don't. If everything goes right, you often don't find yourself in that situation. So let's briefly touch on that. Finally, some Kumar Rocker news, and I know some Mets fans are probably, moved on past this, or some Mets fans are still wondering, how did we get here with this? News dropped recently that Kumar Rocker had a minor scope on his shoulder. Joe, when I texted you right about this, your first reaction was what about the minor scope on the shoulder?
I've never heard of a minor shoulder surgery before. But with that said,
it's not like a knee that gets cleaned out.
Yeah, he was throwing an indie ball. His velocity was there. So it seems like he's doing okay. And apparently, I saw from Kylie McDaniel over at ESPN that they provided medical information to teams, which kind of surprises me. And it seems like Kumar Rocker is trending towards being a first-round pick again. And, I wish him all the best. Whatever the Mets saw on his physical, they obviously weren't comfortable signing him. And that's why the Mets have those 2 first-round picks, like you mentioned at the top of the segment. But, yeah, I mean, it's tough to say where exactly he's going to go, but it definitely sounds like he is trending towards being a first-round pick for the second year in a row.
Yeah, well, good for Rocker. Obviously, we'll still be rooting for him and his major league career, the prospects of his major league career. And a reminder to everybody, the Mets cannot redraft Kumar Rocker. If they didn't have the medical information last year, say they got it this year, and they go, okay, everything's looking good, even if they felt that way, which is highly unlikely, well, they cannot.
They technically can, but they would need his permission to do so. And something tells me he won't want to get picked by the Mets again. And something tells me the Mets probably wouldn't want to pick him either. So this feels like, all right, it didn't happen, and Kumar Rocker will find himself a new home.
That's right. All right, so next week we're really excited. We're going to have Tommy Tanis on the show. He is the VP of Amateur and International Scouting for the Mets. Joe and I have had Tommy on before, but it's been a while, and we're really excited to talk to him. Joe, as we get close to the draft, what's the number one thing you would want to ask someone like Tommy right now that, let's be real, this is the time of year that is the busiest for them as they are stacking a board, getting ready to go. This is a huge draft for them, and he is kind of the guy for the Mets draft. And the Mets, even before Steve Cohen got here, they have been a successful drafting team when you compare it to the rest of the majors. So what are you excited to have Tommy on for? I know I'm ready to go. I have so much for him.
I mean, I'll save the juicy stuff for next week, but what I really would like to know about is this injured college pitching class.
Same.
How do they evaluate the level of injuries? And it goes beyond college too. I mean, Dylan Lesko is a guy who I had to the Mets in mock 1.0, had Tommy John surgery. There's another high school pitcher, Cole Phillips, who probably would have gone in the late first, early second, also had Tommy John. How do they evaluate these players individually and then also be able to stack them on the board? Like, how do you stack 7 guys with Tommy John surgery? Are they stacked differently? Do you put them in groups? So that would be that's one thing that I think I'll ask him next week, but I'll save a lot of the fun questions for that.
All right, everybody will have to tune in then. Before we go, as always, we are not leaving without a mailbag question. And I really like this one sent on Twitter this week. Reminder, you guys can send them as a 5-star review for the Mets pod. We will prioritize those, of course. Or you could send them to me or Joe on Twitter. So this is from Jim D. He said, The biggest player let down in the first half, and can that player rebound to have a successful second half? Joe, I will give you the floor first because I am a nice co-host. Who are you rolling with here?
Biggest letdown. I mean, I don't want to go back to Eduardo Escobar. I mean, we talked about him, but that certainly was a guy who had a bit of a letdown of a first half. I don't know if this guy's going to necessarily rebound, but can James McCann become go back to being a serviceable offensive catcher? Like, I'm not asking James McCann to be the guy that was really good in 2019 and 2020. I'm just looking for a guy to hit a good amount better than what a pitcher would, and he is not much greater than that. Can that happen? I'm not sure, but to me, that's the biggest letdown. Is he obviously had the injury, and he's still fresh back from the injury. Can he up his offensive game to the point where you don't feel like catcher's an automatic out? That's kind of where I think, if with his defensive prowess, if you could get him to that point, I think that would be a good thing.
I think so too, especially when you factor in that they can get a DH at the deadline that performs much better than, unfortunately, JD and Dom have, and that'll kind of not balance it out, because you never want a dead spot in the lineup, right? Like, you don't want McCann's spot to be the new pitcher spot. That's just ridiculous in this era of baseball. A lot of teams are not going to be functioning like that. High-profile teams, the Mets, the Braves, the Dodgers, all those teams. So I'm with you there. Now, obviously, you and I are very skeptical that he can bounce back in the second half, but he's some name you have to bring up. I'll give you a guy that I think can bounce back in the second half to what he is, right? He has not been bad, but he has not been himself. That's Chris Bassitt to me. Now, with Bassitt, to me, he's not been bad. I would do that trade all over again, anytime. But I think Bassitt can have a big-time second half here, Joe, if he does this. To me, it's eliminating the monthly really bad start, right? He has one every single month where it's 5 runs. Here it is right here. In April, he had a start where he gave up 5 earned runs. In May, he had a start where he gave up 8 earned runs. In June, he had a start where he gave up 7 earned runs. I don't care about the 6 innings, 3 earned runs. That's a quality start in today's game. And he has a million of those, these 6 innings, 3 earned runs. That's fine. With this offense, that's fine. The one start per month, Joe, can he eliminate it where it takes the Mets out of the game for the most part? Because Bassett's their number 3. When deGrom and Scherzer are here, Bassitt is a guy that there are big expectations, and he has pitched at a high level. The home run percentage is up a notch this year. I think it was 2.5 last year. It's around 3.5 this year. So when you look at Bassitt, he's somebody that, to give a full answer to that question, he's the one I think can bounce back in the second half to what he truly is.
That's a great pick, and I think we come to the conclusion that Max Scherzer's back, so Chris Bassitt's back, right? I think that's pretty much how it works. Max is in the dugout. They're back. They have their bromance where they really pine over the data. But I agree with you. I think Bassitt being a bounce-back candidate for the rest of the year is going to be huge. He's the number 3 behind Jake and Max when they're both healthy and right, which means Bassitt's going to be starting some prime playoff games here in the next couple months as long as things keep trending as they are. So definitely important for Bassitt to go back to being what was expected when he was acquired and what he is for most starts, like you mentioned.
It is funny to call a third starter that's pitched to a 4 ERA, 6-5. He started 15 games, which is a big value proposition. A guy that needs to bounce back in the second half. But that's the kind of expectations put on Bassitt, who's set to hit free agency most likely at the end of this season, and I think he will get it done. So, Joe, another episode in the books as the Mets look to close out this series against the Reds. We're looking forward to Max Scherzer being back on the mound. Closing thoughts as we get into a crazy time in Metsland. We got deGrom hopefully working his way back for real right now. Scherzer back in the rotation. Alvarez promoted to AAA. The MLB Draft, that is your baby. And right after that, the MLB trade deadline. So closing thoughts on a jam-packed time of the year for the first place New York Mets.
Whole lot of great stuff going on, and it's going to be a crazy month here. And when we talk next week, you'll get to hear from Mets VP of Scouting, Tommy Tanis, to really preview the draft. And from then, you know, they're in a Brave series. They have 15 games left with Atlanta. So next week's show, it'll be, you know, during a Brave series. So really a lot going on here over the next 3.5 weeks. Yeah, need a deep breath. A ton happening.
All right, well, we'll be all over it, so stay right here on SNY to the Mets Pod. A reminder to subscribe to the Mets Pod, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch on SNY's YouTube. You can keep up with all the Mets content that Joe and I do. He's at PSL The Flushing on Twitter. I'm at Connor J. Rogers on Twitter, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you next week.